as soon as I remember where the button is. Welcome, everybody. Excited to have you in class today. My name is Carrie Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And today's class is all about the Constitution's ratification. How did it come to be the document that we know of today? How did we actually get to say okay to it? And then what came out of that ratification process with the Federalist Papers? I'm very excited today because you're all here with us and you're going to ask lots of questions and engage in dialogue in that chat. But we also have Tom Donnelly, one of our top scholars at the National Constitution Center. So Tom, welcome everybody. Do your intro and then we'll dive in deep.
Absolutely. Welcome everyone. So happy to have you here. Can't wait to discuss ratification.
Ratification, Tom. And I think that's the best way to start. When we talk about this, you know, we have so many questions around ratification, and I kind of like listed a ton of questions here for us. And students, if you have more, you can put them in the chat. But, you know, before we even get started and before we dive into it, I would love to understand in like the simplest way, what is ratification? I know it's in the Constitution and we're going to look at that section of the Constitution, and it's a process, but can you help define what that word even means as we start?
Absolutely. So, I mean, broadly speaking, to ratify, and here's the definition on the screen, it's the action of signing or giving formal consent to a treaty, contract, agreement, making it officially valid. For our purposes, though, it's the American people saying yes or no to the new Constitution. So we sent from the Constitutional Convention a proposal to the American people, and the American people acting in their states through state ratifying conventions had the power to say yes or no.
So I love that idea. And when we think about this, and we talk about contracts, kids and adults hear about contracts all the time. It's a deal that you make with each other, and it's formal and it's on paper. So that paper that is sent to the states is the Constitution, and the deal is between the people and their government. Are we going to make this deal? Are we going to have a handshake? And that handshake is the ratification. Did I have that pretty right?
That's right, Curry. That's a good way to think about it.
So big idea, though, because when we think about the deal that's being made between the people and the government, and that it comes out in this Constitution, can you give us ratification, kind of not just the definition of what ratification means, but why do we study this? Why is it so important to study this moment in time? And what kind of significance does it make? So we talk about ratification, and so many times, you know, our students and our adults that we talk to at the Constitution Center, they skip this part, or they went really fast over this part. But this is kind of a big deal, this moment in time. And so I want to almost like give it some respect and pause and say, why is it such a big deal?
Absolutely. And so we have the big idea here up on the screen, and this is something to keep in mind throughout our discussion, which is, you know, when the Constitution was signed by the framers of the Constitutional Convention on September 17th, 1787, which we celebrate as Constitution Day now, it was a mere proposal. The framers understood that the people themselves had to accept this new Constitution. So acting through their state ratifying conventions, the American people had to decide whether to give the Constitution life, whether to say yes or no. So even after all of those months in Philadelphia, those hot, smelly, difficult months where they hammered out this new agreement of government, even though there were famous people in the room like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and James Madison, in the end, the founding generation said, no, this is up to you, the American people. And what's amazing about this moment, Curry, and it's almost hard to capture today, you know, we know how the story ends. The supporters of the new Constitution, the Federalists, they won the battle over ratification. The American people said yes to the new Constitution. For us, this story may lack some drama. It may seem inevitable, but far from it. The battle over ratification, which again, it's the Federalists or the supporters, the Anti-Federalists opposed the new Constitution. It was really, really, really close. Just a few shifted votes in key conventions like Massachusetts, Virginia, New York could have changed the outcome. And part of the reason too, Curry, and this is another thing we forget, is that the American people were surprised by this new Constitution. When the Congress sent those delegates to the convention in Philadelphia, they said, okay, you have a framework of government, the Articles of Confederation. We don't really love this framework of government. Go to Philadelphia and figure out how to make it better. And so the convention delegates, they meet in secret in Philadelphia, and they come up with this new document, this Constitution. And the American people are thinking, oh, they're just going to sort of rework the Articles of Confederation. Instead, it's this whole new framework of government. And so they'd have to read it, think about it, and decide whether or not they wanted it.
And that's huge. And I love that you say that, like, it seems like over dramatized now, but it was a battle. Like, and that's the biggest thing. It's a battle. And I love that this document on September 17th is just a document, and it's given back to the people and says to the people, you give it power. You're the we and we the people, so your power has to come from you. And so that's really what makes it a contract. It makes it a deal because the power is given back from the people. I love that idea. And they get to say yes or no. And we'll talk about, like, who are they that get to say yes and no in a minute. But you kind of tick through a lot of things there that I want to just go over one time. The battle between these two groups, almost like two football teams, and that will be my only sports reference ever in this course. The one football team is the Federalists, and the other, or I should say basketball team, because I know there's a dissenters basketball team as well. But there's the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists that are the two teams kind of going at it. When we're going to get into these stories of who they are and why do they have these big battles, but what do we know about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists? Let's start with both of them and break them down about what do we know about why they were on different sides, but who they were.
Sure. So let's start with the Federalists. They're the supporters of the Constitution. I mean, if we're looking at the convention itself, the big supporters in the room of the new Constitution are George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. They're the most beloved Americans at the time. Them just being in that room helping craft this document told the American people, this is something important. This is something we have to pay attention to. But if we look beyond that, there's all sorts of gifted political leaders and thinkers among the Federalists. There's James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and then folks like John Dickinson, James Wilson, Gouverneur Morris, who Americans don't know as much today, but were really important figures in their own time. Overall, the Federalists tended to be better educated than the Anti-Federalists. They were more likely to be wealthy and live in cities. And broadly speaking, why did they think we needed this new Constitution? Well, they thought that in order to grow into a great nation, we needed a stronger national government. And so they looked at the years before the Constitutional Convention, and they said, Congress, it didn't do a great job during the American Revolution. These Articles of Confederation we have, it really creates too weak a national government. And we've also had this experience of living under state constitutions and state by state during this period, and they didn't work so well either. And so what we really need to do is we need to create a stronger national government, one that could really address genuinely national problems. And so that's sort of the Federalists. That's their pitch to the American people. That's what they're trying to do with this new document.
So Federalist, pro-Constitution. That's like the easiest way to line them up. They're going to be for it. We should do this. By the way, yep, it feels like a big bait and switch. We got a totally new document on you, but it's way, way better because nothing was working, or not many things were working real well. And then you have the Anti-Federalists, and they get no play. First of all, they don't even have their own name. They're just the anti of the Federalists. So they don't get a lot of play. But when reading the Anti-Federalist writings around this, they make a lot of good points. And that's what I love about what we do at the Constitution Center, is we look at these big constitutional questions and say, hey, there's good arguments on all sides. But we should even look back then. What was the argument to say that the Constitution was not a good document? And there's some really amazing writing. So Anti-Federalists, do they wait till the document's out? Are they, not at the convention? Who are these people?
Absolutely. So we're gonna get to the beginning of the Anti-Federalists at the convention itself in a moment. But just to back up, the Anti-Federalists, they oppose the new Constitution. So they're the antis. They're against this new Constitution. And we may look at the Federalists and the Federalist Papers and things like that, and they're the more famous figures today. But the Anti-Federalist camp had its own list of real political heavyweights from the founding. It had Virginia's George Mason, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee. It had Massachusetts there. It had Samuel Adams, Elbridge Gerry, Mercy Otis Warren. And it also had New York's powerful Governor George Clinton on their side. Generally speaking, the Anti-Federalists, they were more likely to be small farmers, lawyers or merchants, and their support was stronger sort of if you're looking at each state in the western part of the state rather than in the eastern part of states, in rural areas rather than in cities. And they had greater support in larger states rather than in the smaller states writ large. But more broadly, for the Anti-Federalists, what was their main reason for opposing this new Constitution? In many ways, the ratification debate ends up getting into questions of political power and where to place it. And the big fancy word here for this is it's a battle over federalism. which is just a simple way of saying if you have political power, how much of it is going to go to the national government, how much of it is going to go to the states. And so while the Federalists are arguing for a powerful new national government, the Anti-Federalists defended a vision of America rooted in powerful states. Simply put, the Anti-Federalists feared that the new Constitution gave the national government, this new national government, too much power.
I think that's great. So they're worried that the balance has shifted too far. So I always think about like a pendulum swinging, and that the Articles of Confederation were on one side, where the federal government had almost no power to really enforce anything. And then they're worried that we swung the pendulum too far the other way, going back and forth. So got it. So these two teams are on different sides for all valid reasons. And when we think about ratification and we think about the Constitutional Convention, this is kind of the energy really starts at the convention. How do we actually take it from this is what we think is a blueprint for our government and to get it ratified? So kind of walk us through the convention. How does it get to ratification? And then how do we get to the people that are worried about it?
Yeah, so I mean, the convention itself, it's meeting from May until September 1787. And so for a lot of that time, what the delegates are trying to do, first they have to agree with one another. We're getting rid of the Articles of Confederation. We're proposing a new form of government. They do that very quickly. But over those months, they have to figure out what branches of government are we going to have? And so we end up having three branches of government: a legislative branch led by Congress, which is responsible for making the laws, an executive branch led by a single president responsible for enforcing the laws, and a judicial branch led by a Supreme Court that's going to be responsible for interpreting the law. So they're spending a lot of time at the convention figuring out this structure of government, these branches of government, and what powers to give them. We're going to focus our story here at the end of the convention. So we're in September 1787. So it's the closing days of the convention, and the framers are they're putting together the final details of the Constitution. They've hammered out many of the big compromises, but in the view of some of the delegates, this new Constitution forgets something really important: a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights, a listing of the rights that are most cherished by the American people, things like free speech, religious liberty, on and on. Today, Americans cherish their Bill of Rights. For many Americans, it's the heart of the Constitution, but the framers left one out. And, we look back and we say, why? Why on earth wouldn't you put a Bill of Rights in there? I mean, the short answer is probably the simple one, which is they just had too much on their plate. It was a hot, sticky, smelly, difficult summer. They crafted this entire new government from scratch. They had heated debates, bitter disagreements. They had hard-fought compromises. And by September, the delegates were tired. They just wanted to see their families. They wanted to sleep in their own beds. They wanted to go home, and they were ready to close up shop and leave. And this push for a Bill of Rights, Curry, doesn't emerge until these closing days of the convention. So you can imagine what they're thinking as George Mason, one of the delegates from Virginia, gets up at the convention here near the end of the convention and says, oh, by the way, where's the Bill of Rights?
So Rick Beeman, one of our favorite scholars, wrote this awesome book called Plain Honest Men. And he used to crack me up all the time when he would be in Signers Hall giving tours of Signers Hall, top scholar in the country. And he would say they were just tired. And I love that because you're right. You look at the Constitution and everybody thinks that the Bill of Rights is in the original Constitution. It's not. And so the battle was really hey guys, we might have forgot to protect the people. We might have forgot some of those individual rights that you so talked about in that declaration. But he just reminded us they're tired. And that does remind us that they're human. They're humans that have been away from their homes and their families for so many months, have gone through this really hard planning process and come up with an amazing document. But you know what? When you're done, you're done. And maybe we need to step away for a minute. And I love Mason. Mason coming back in. No, guys, we can do it. Let's do it. We'll be really fast. It'll be fine. But he had a good reason to think he could do it quickly. I'm going to give Mason some credit here.
Yeah, absolutely. So George Mason, he's a neighbor of George Washington, a friend of Washington's. But he's most famous at this time for he wrote Virginia's Declaration of Rights. And in many ways, this is America's first written Bill of Rights. It was written a few weeks before the Declaration of Independence. And so Thomas Jefferson, when he's putting together the Declaration of Independence, he has George Mason's Declaration of Rights right next to him. When the Declaration of Rights is then published throughout the country at this point in time, state after state would look at it. And as they're putting together their state constitutions, they would also pull and basically often cut and paste from George Mason's Declaration of Rights. So Mason's here at the end of the convention. It's September 12th through the 17th. And he raises his hand and he says, really, you know what we're missing here is we're missing a Bill of Rights. We should do it. He said it will, quote, give great quiet to the people. And his pitch was really simple. He says, I'm the Virginia Declaration of Rights guy. I know how to do this. I wrote the best Bill of Rights that we have in our state constitutions. Give me a few hours. Give me a few days. I can do it. We'll get it in there. The Constitution will be so much better. George Mason didn't lack for confidence. And what ends up happening is the delegates say no. And not a single state ends up supporting Mason here. And he is absolutely devastated by this.
And so they get to the end of the convention and they're asked, everybody in the room is asked, oh, it's so important to have our names on this document. Even though it is not validated yet by the states and the people, we still want to put our names on it, like good housekeeping seal of approval. We'll put our name on it. You'll see our names and you'll believe that we believe in it because we signed it. So all of them are asked to sign it, but these three guys refuse to sign it. And so that really starts with Mason's story of worry about what's not in it. But he does have kind of some other big players supporting him with this.
Absolutely. So, I mean, it's kind of an amazing moment, Curry, because we have this dramatic moment at the end of the convention where Benjamin Franklin gives this final speech saying, look, we've had this long battle at the convention. We've all compromised. I don't love everything that's in there, but everyone, you're all bright people, but doubt your righteousness for now. And let's all get behind this new constitution. But Elbridge Gerry, Edmund Randolph, and George Mason say no. They say, Benjamin Franklin, we're not going to do this. They refuse to sign the new constitution. Now, you may just think these are three grumps. These are just three, disagreeable people. But these are people who are really heavily involved in the debates throughout the Constitutional Convention. And so why did they refuse to sign? Well, one reason is what Mason already said at the end of the convention was the Constitution needs a Bill of Rights. You didn't put one in there. That's a serious flaw. But more generally, they refused to sign because they thought the Constitution created a powerful new national government that was destined to sort of seize all political power, swallow up the states, and abuse the rights of the American people. So the battle over ratification, in a certain sense, the battle between Federalists and Anti-Federalists begins right here at the end of the convention.
And I think it's really fascinating because the names that you talked about earlier are just not only the people in the room. People like John Jay were never at the convention, but they are really quickly brought into the battle at the end of the convention during ratification. So, some states ratified pretty quickly, and a lot of states get full credit for being one state gets full credit for being the first. So half my family lives in Delaware, and we always say, we give you credit, Delaware, you were first in ratifying the Constitution. But how quickly do the debates begin around this Constitution? It's September 17th, 1787, they signed. 2 days later, they printed it in the Pennsylvania packet. And every delegate leaving the convention on the 17th is given one of those copies. And they all go home to start to distribute the Constitution. So like you said, Tom, everybody has to read it and understand what is going on. They didn't have Twitter, didn't have Facebook, no other way to get it around. So it's really being handed around by newspapers. So how quickly does the debate begin?
Immediately. I mean, it begins really, really quick. It begins, frankly, in certain ways with Mason sitting there on September 12th at the convention. He has his copy of the Constitution there, and he's scribbling his objections in the margin. And these become George Mason's famous objections to the Constitution, which he'd send to a lot of his friends out in the United States, arguing why the new Constitution shouldn't be ratified. But what we know immediately from the Constitution itself is that the rules of the game are written right in there. So how are we going to ratify this new Constitution? Well, if you look at the text of the Constitution, Article 7 provides the rules. There's going to be ratification of the Constitution when 9 states say yes. And so we know it's going to be this battle between, at a state-by-state basis, in various conventions in those states, state by state saying yes or no. The race is to 9 states. And so should we tick through sort of how this process worked, Curry, or at least the state by state?
Absolutely. State by state, let's tick through and I find this as like a brilliant marketing campaign too. They have to get to the states if they want this ratified, and they have to talk them into it. So like, it's not just defending, it's also really promoting as well, that the Federalist Papers and the work.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's just a vigorous debate that happens between, we know the Federalist Papers, but there are so many anti-Federalist writings too, arguing the other side. And so you have in newspapers, pamphlets, these battles happening. But you have the battles happening in state ratifying conventions themselves. The first state to ratify the Constitution is Delaware on December 7th, 1787. And it's unanimous. It's a unanimous decision by the convention. It's a really quick convention. And then we see 4 other states here also ratifying quickly. There's Pennsylvania also in December 1787. It's a bitter fight, but it ends up being a division 46-23. Then we see 2 more unanimous states in a row, New Jersey, again in December 1787, and Georgia, January 1788, both unanimous. And then in Connecticut, we also see a lopsided victory for the Federalists. They ratified in January 1788. 128-40. So the Federalists are off to a really good start here. We see quick ratifications, especially you see here in some of the smaller states like Georgia and Connecticut. And part of the reason why is, one, they thought they could have got a good deal in the new Constitution. So they have one of the houses of Congress, the Senate, gives every state, no matter its size, whether it's a big state or a small state, equal representation and equal political power. They also thought it was really important to have this national union for the protection of their own citizens. They thought they were worried about being swallowed up by other bigger states or by other countries. So the small states thought they got a good deal.
And I think that's really important, like why, and this totally does remind me of like sports, like moving forward and watching, it's like the Olympics and like watching the teams move forward and the bracket race that's going on. But, Massachusetts is really a kind of a big deal what happens in Massachusetts. And so there's some major players in that discussion and what happens. So do you want to talk for a minute about the Massachusetts Compromise? We love compromises.
Yeah, absolutely. So we see that the Federalists, they run into serious opposition in the important state of Massachusetts. And so here there's a close division between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, the people who end up actually elected to the ratifying convention. And so 2 of the state's leading voices in Massachusetts are also critical of the new Constitution. So there we see Samuel Adams and John Hancock, 2 heroes of the American Revolution, skeptical of this new Constitution. And so we see Anti-Federalists in the convention saying, if we're going to ratify this new Constitution, we need agreement that you are going to amend it in certain ways that address our concerns. And so there's this battle between the Federalists saying, no, you have to take it or leave it based on what it is. And the Anti-Federalists saying, you have to promise to amend this Constitution before we ratify. And so the Federalists get together with Samuel Adams, they get together with John Hancock, and they put together what we affectionately now call as the Massachusetts Compromise. And so here, what effectively they agree to is the convention says, we will ratify this new Constitution. So some Federalists will get on board, sign on to the new Constitution, but you Federalists have to agree to amend the Constitution when this new government meets. We're going to put together some suggested amendments. In that first Congress, you have to agree, you're going to look at these amendments and make the Constitution better. And so the Federalists, they needed to win. They needed victory. They agreed to this compromise. And so in the end, Massachusetts votes in favor of ratification in February 1788. But even then, the vote's really close. It's 187 to 168. It's still a very close vote. But this model that we get from Massachusetts, the Federalists then use in state after that, where there are states coming up like Virginia and New York, where there are a lot of anti-Federalists. And so the Federalists will sort of use this Massachusetts model to secure the ratification of the Constitution. And you see here the sort of the timeline of the remaining states. Maryland in April 1788, it's a lopsided vote. South Carolina in May 1788, again, a fairly lopsided vote. And then we see this key vote in New Hampshire, June 21st, 1788. This is the 9th state. This is when the Constitution is ratified, June 21st, 1788, 57 to 47. Under Article 7 of the Constitution, the Constitution's ratified. But for the Federalists, the job isn't done. There still are states that haven't ratified. And for them, they're wondering what's going to happen in 2 really, really important states, Virginia and New York. Virginia, the convention there is really closely divided between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. But again, the Federalists are able to broker a compromise, win that close fight 89 to 79 in June 1788. And then finally, New York there's a lopsided Anti-Federalist majority in the ratifying convention. But again, they're able to broker a compromise. So on July 26, 1788, in another bitterly close fight, New York votes to ratify, but the vote, it's by 3 votes. It's 30-27. And think about that. Who's in that convention? It's Alexander Hamilton and John Jay sitting there arguing for the new Constitution. They only won by 3 votes.
So imagine if they weren't delegates to that state, or they weren't working for that state, it would have never gone through, or maybe taken so much longer. I do think it's really fascinating, because when we think about who was at the Constitutional Convention and then who played a part in the ratification, then you start to see so many of these players from the Revolution. And I love the story of the Massachusetts Compromise. And I believe the way the story goes is John Hancock was not feeling well, and he's a big guy. And then at the very end, he comes in and he has a blanket wrapped around him because it's cold. It's February in Massachusetts, not a lovely time period to be in Massachusetts. But he did that also to show kind of, I'm here under kind of not feeling well, under duress. And I'm going to say, let's go for it. Let's move it forward. Let's be positive. And there's like this big scene with the blanket. They're very dramatic. I love all these people. So as we get into kind of looking at this Bill of Rights, that Massachusetts had such a huge hand. So Massachusetts must have made Mason feel so much better. He was like, that's what I was talking about, people. And so we talk about the Bill of Rights being added. But Dennis asked this great question. When we think about in the beginning and, why didn't they listen to Mason? Was it just because they were really tired? Or did people like Madison think, you know what, it's fine. We don't need a Bill of Rights. Was that a part of it as well?
Yeah, I mean, you see in the ratifying debates at the convention, but also especially in the ratifying debates, principled arguments by the Federalists as to why they didn't think a Bill of Rights was necessary. I think one of the big things is that for Madison, this is true of Madison and Hamilton, for instance, is they thought that the new Constitution did a really good job at limiting the powers of the national government through things like separation of powers, checks and balances. And in that sense, for them, getting the structure of the Constitution right was the best way to protect the rights of the people. And they thought, no matter what you write into the new Constitution, people might ignore these rights, leaders might ignore these rights, but the structures of government are still going to protect all of the rights that we care about. So in part, that's the principled argument they're making.
Awesome. Now, if so many of those arguments are spelled out clearly in the written debates that are in the newspapers with the Federalist Papers. So we have about 3 minutes. So really quick, Tom, kind of just give all of our students a little bit of exposure to who are the main writers, what did they write, and what are some of the main pieces that they write that our students should take some time, look at, try to read, pull out big ideas from?
Yeah, so the Federalist Papers, they are a series of essays, 85 essays written largely for the audience in New York. So they served, we think of them today as these great works of political theory, but they were there for a great political purpose, which was to largely persuade the anti-Federalist New Yorkers to come on board with the new Constitution. And so they're authored by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. And so two really big Federalist Papers, if you want to start with two really big ones, there are two by Madison that I would really flag. One is Federalist number 10. And so what Madison's dealing with in Federalist number 10 is what he calls the problem of faction. And so this is just a kind of a weird word today that we don't use as often, but really what it means is he's concerned about groups of people who are going to be driven by passion, not reason, and then by private self-interest, not the public good. And so what Madison is arguing is, what this new Constitution provides, what this new national government provides, is that it's creating a big structure for a large union. What that accomplishes is that in a big union, you're going to have a bunch of different factions, and it's going to be really, really hard for any majority to cohere around a vision of the good. And as a result of that, what that's going to do is it's going to force different sorts of people who think different sorts of things to compromise with one another, and that's also going to protect people who have minority views from being oppressed by a majority. So it's Madison's way of saying, no, what in the end, the Constitution and the new national government, it's important that it's over a large government because it's going to limit the dangers of faction. So that's Federalist 10. The other one is Federalist number 51, which gives us the really powerful arguments about the new Constitution and its commitment to separation of powers and checks and balances. And so what Madison is speaking of here is, everyone's concerned that this new national government's going to have too much power. One of the big anti-Federalist writers that they're responding to is a writer known as Brutus, which many people think was New York's Robert Yates. And so what Robert Yates, he says two things. He says many things, but one thing he says is that this new government has too much power. The Constitution itself is too broadly worded. What we're going to see over time is a national government that takes all power, that basically destroys the states, that ignores the voices of the American people, and that in the end, we are going to end up with an out-of-touch elite that's very little different from what we had with Parliament and King in London during the American Revolution. So he's very fearful of a powerful national government, and what he values is basically what America already had, which was a government where most power was with the states. And so what Madison's responding to in Federalist 51 is that, Brutus, yes, you are absolutely right. If there's something we know about human nature, political leaders are going to try to seize more power over time. But don't worry, we've gotten the structure of this Constitution right. We've divided the powers of government into three branches of government: a legislative branch, an executive branch, a judiciary, so a Congress, a president, and a Supreme Court. And then we've given those branches the ability to check one another. We've given them powers to make sure that no single branch of government is too powerful. So Congress may pass a law, but the president can veto or cancel that law, and the Supreme Court can decide that that law is unconstitutional, so use judicial review. So over time, these checks in place will ensure that the government doesn't become more powerful. But more importantly, it's also going to make our politics better. It's going to slow politics down. It's going to make sure that any idea that the national government wants to accomplish, it has to get through Congress. It has to get through the president. It has to get through the Supreme Court. And hopefully over time, what this is going to do, it's going to promote public deliberation. It's going to slow politics down. It's going to promote reasoned debate. And it's going to take bad ideas. It's going to throw them out. It's going to take flawed ideas and make them better. It's going to take good ideas and make them law. And so that's the big theory that's unifying the Federalists here in the Federalist Papers.
Oh, I love that, Tom. That was really good how you broke that down. I love Federalist 51. I love that these papers are countering each other too. So they're putting out there what their ideas are and what their worries are and why, and then they're responding to each other. And to think again about how tight New York is, how close that vote is, and that it's the last state to ratify, talks about why this is in New York, why it's such an important debate to have it. But also the Federalists had some help with the New York newspapers that were kind of on their side and said, yeah, we're going to publish all these pieces. Now, Federalist 51, which homework assignment people, you have Brutus, you have Federalist 10, and you have Federalist 51. Just glance at them, but look for words like this. Ambition must be made to counter ambition. So that idea that if you set up the system right, people will check each other, that what Tom just walked through, that bad ideas will be thrown out, flawed ideas will be made better, and great ideas will become law. That is a great kind of formula. How do we do this? We need to really push each other and test each other to make things better. And that does not mean fast. That means well and well thought out. And then the other line, which everybody likes to quote, and I love it, and it comes up with Lincoln often: if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So you can't trust it to the people. You have to make sure there's checks in the system. So all these big ideas set up almost an explanation of what the Constitution is, not just in parts, but in overall theory and strategy. And so that's what I think we love so much about the Federalist Papers. They help explain the big idea. And so much to look into, but we've already out of time. So Tom, wrap us up with the big idea one more time about how the people are sovereign with this Constitution, and then we'll turn it back to the people to read all their fun documents.
Yeah, no, that's great, Curry. And that's the thing to remember. What's ratification about? It's about the big principle behind the Constitution, popular sovereignty, that the government is ultimately driven by us, not a king, not an aristocracy, not the elites. And so here, again, the big idea is that when the Constitution signed by the framers of the Constitutional Convention, it was just a proposal. Madison himself said, this is just a piece of paper. It means nothing right now. So the framers understood that the people themselves still had to accept this new Constitution. So acting through their state ratifying conventions, the American people had to decide whether to give the Constitution life, whether to say yes or no, and they said yes.
Awesome. I love it. With a lot of debate, a lot of heated energy, and a lot of making things better with the Bill of Rights. So it is about compromise as well, compromise that gives us change to make it better. So thank you so much, Tom. This was a great class. We went through a lot there, students. We will hang out for a couple minutes afterwards and make sure you have all your questions asked. But Tom, I want to thank you so much. And students who are jumping off, thank you so much. See you next time in class. Oh, by the way, on Friday at 1 o'clock Eastern time. So that is, if I do my math right, I have to always work in reverse. 10 o'clock, did I do that right? Yes, 10 o'clock Pacific time, we are going to ask Madison himself, not really, himself, James Madison from Colonial Williamsburg will be joining us on Friday to have a conversation about what he thought about the Bill of Rights. So it should be really fun. That is 1 o'clock or 10 o'clock on Friday. Come join us, and thank you all so much. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, everyone.
Pause that. Oh, stop. Okay, so I think it was Gregory. Thank you, Lorelei. Nice to see you. Gregory, I want to make sure you saw who supported the Bill of Rights. I think we were going to start with these three. So the idea of a Bill of Rights, the idea that the Constitution shouldn't be ratified without it, or at least a promise of it. So Elbridge, Jerry, Randolph, and Mason. I also put that in the chat, but I wanted to make sure that you could see the dissenters. That's our loving name for them. But George Mason's, the George Mason University's basketball team is named as dissenters. So just as a fun little anecdote. Okay, awesome. I think everybody is good. So with that, Tom, I think we're good to wrap up class.
Okay, thanks, Corey. See everyone next week.
Thank you.